Have you ever wondered why some countries became rich centuries ago while others struggled for generations? Why did certain cities become centers of trade, innovation, and wealth while others remained poor? Why did places like England, the Netherlands, and parts of Western Europe experience rapid economic growth long before much of the rest of the world? Was it luck, natural resources, powerful kings, military strength? According to Adam Smith, the answer is much more complicated and much more interesting. By the time we reach Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, Smith shifts his focus away from economic theory and toward history. The first two books explained how wealth is created and how it grows. Now Smith asks a different question. If the principles of wealth are universal, why didn't every nation become rich at the same time? Why did economic progress happen unevenly across history? This question fascinated Smith because understanding the past helps explain the present, and his answer starts with a simple observation: societies do not always develop the way you would expect. The logical path to prosperity. Imagine you're building a civilization from scratch. No cities, no factories, no stock markets, no banks, just people trying to survive. What would develop first? Most people would probably say agriculture, and they would be right. Before anything else can happen, people need food. Without food, there are no cities. Without food, there are no merchants. Without food, there are no engineers, artists, teachers, or business owners. Everyone would spend nearly all their time trying to survive. Agriculture creates something incredibly important: a surplus. A surplus means producing more food than you immediately need. And once a society produces a surplus, everything changes. Some people no longer need to farm. They can become blacksmiths, builders, carpenters, merchants, inventors. This is where specialization begins. And as we learned in Book 1, specialization is one of the foundations of wealth. So Smith believed the natural order of development should look something like this: agriculture first, manufacturing second, commerce third. Food creates surplus, surplus allows specialization, specialization creates production, production leads to trade, trade creates wealth. Simple, logical, makes perfect sense. But then Smith noticed something strange. History didn't always follow this path. Europe took a different route. When Smith looked at the history of Europe, he realized something unusual had happened. Instead of agriculture leading smoothly into industry and commerce, development often took a much messier route. Large areas of land remained under the control of powerful landowners. Trade developed unevenly. Cities rose and fell. Economic growth moved slowly for centuries. At times, it seemed like Europe was holding itself back, and this raised an important question. If the ingredients for prosperity existed, why wasn't prosperity spreading faster? Why did economic progress seem stuck? To answer that, Smith began examining the institutions that shaped society, and one institution stood above all others: the feudal system. A world dominated by land. To understand Smith's argument, you need to picture what life looked like hundreds of years before modern capitalism. Land was everything. If you owned land, you had wealth. If you controlled large amounts of land, you had power. And if you didn't own land, life could be extremely difficult. Most people lived in rural areas. Most people worked in agriculture. Most economic activity revolved around land ownership. Today, people build fortunes through technology, finance, manufacturing, entertainment, and entrepreneurship. Back then, land was the primary source of wealth. This created a society where power was concentrated in the hands of a relatively small group of landowners, and according to Smith, that concentration of power often slowed economic progress. Wealth and power are not the same thing. One of the most interesting themes in Book 3 is the distinction between wealth and power. Many rulers throughout history focused on accumulating power. They wanted larger territories, more political influence, bigger armies, greater control. But Smith argued that power alone does not create prosperity. A king can control vast amounts of land. That doesn't automatically make society productive. A noble can own thousands of acres. That doesn't automatically increase innovation. Real wealth comes from productive activity, from people creating goods and services, from specialization, from trade, from investment, from markets. This idea was radical because it challenged the traditional view of how societies became successful. For centuries, many leaders believed strength came from political control. Smith argued that long-term prosperity came from economic freedom and productive enterprise. The hidden heroes of economic growth. One thing that makes Smith's work so fascinating is that he often focuses on ordinary people rather than famous rulers. History books tend to talk about kings, queens, generals, and wars. Smith looked somewhere else. He looked at farmers, merchants, craftsmen, shop owners, workers, traders, the people actually producing and exchanging value. In Smith's view, these were the real engines of economic progress, not because they were powerful, but because they were productive. Every trade, every workshop, every market transaction, every improvement in efficiency, these small actions gradually transformed entire economies. While rulers fought over territory, ordinary people were quietly building prosperity. Why this matters today. At first glance, Book 3 might seem like a history lesson, but Smith is doing something much bigger. He's trying to identify the conditions that allow societies to flourish, and those questions still matter today. Why do some countries attract investment while others struggle? Why do some cities become economic powerhouses? Why do certain regions experience rapid growth while others fall behind? Different technology, different industries, different centuries, but many of the underlying principles remain surprisingly similar. Economic growth depends on more than resources. It depends on institutions, incentives, property rights, markets, and the freedom for people to engage in productive activity. The bigger picture. Book 3 marks a major shift in the wealth of nations. Adam Smith is no longer asking how wealth is created, he's asking why some societies were able to create wealth more successfully than others. To answer that question, he begins a journey through history, a journey that will explore agriculture, land ownership, cities, commerce, and the slow collapse of the feudal world. And as the story unfolds, Smith reaches a surprising conclusion. The rise of modern prosperity wasn't driven primarily by kings, armies, or governments. It was driven by something far less glamorous. Farmers producing surpluses, merchants seeking profit, cities creating opportunities, and millions of ordinary people pursuing better lives through trade and enterprise. That process would eventually reshape the entire world, and it all begins with the foundation of civilization itself, agriculture. Imagine trying to build a modern city in the middle of nowhere. No farms, no food supply, no stable source of nourishment, no agricultural system supporting the population. How long would that city survive? Not very long. People often think wealth begins with factories, banks, technology, or trade. But according to Adam Smith, Every prosperous civilization starts with something much simpler: food. That is why in Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, Smith argues that agriculture should naturally be the first stage of economic development, before commerce, before manufacturing, before financial markets. Agriculture comes first, because without food, nothing else can exist. Civilization begins with surplus. Think about early human societies. For thousands of years, most people spent nearly all their time producing food. If crops failed, people starved. If harvests were poor, communities suffered. There wasn't much room for specialization because survival required constant effort. Then something important happened. Agricultural productivity slowly improved. People began producing more food than they immediately needed. Economists call this a surplus, and according to Adam Smith, surplus changes everything. Once a farmer produces enough food for more than one family, other people are free to do different kinds of work. Some become builders, others become blacksmiths, others become merchants, others become craftsmen. The economy starts diversifying. This is the birth of specialization. And as Smith explained in Book 1, specialization is one of the most powerful drivers of productivity ever discovered. Why food creates freedom. Most people don't think about food very much. We walk into supermarkets and expect shelves to be full. But for most of human history, food was the central economic issue. A society that struggles to feed itself cannot easily develop advanced industries. People simply don't have the time or resources. Imagine a village where every single person must spend all day farming. Who becomes the engineer? Who becomes the teacher? Who becomes the architect? Who becomes the inventor? Nobody. Everyone is occupied with survival. But once agriculture becomes productive enough, something remarkable happens. Labor is released. People can specialize. New professions emerge. Cities begin to grow. Economic complexity increases. This is why Smith believed agriculture forms the foundation of civilization itself. The natural order of development. According to Adam Smith, economic development should follow a fairly logical sequence. It looks like this: agriculture, to manufacturing, to commerce. First, agriculture creates surplus. Then, manufacturing transforms raw materials into useful products. Finally, commerce expands trade and connects larger markets. Smith believed this was the natural order because each stage depends on the previous one. You need food before you can support large populations. You need large populations before you can support large industries. And you need industries before you can support extensive commercial networks. In theory, that's how development should unfold. But as Smith observed, history often takes unexpected turns. Why farmers matter more than people realize. One of the interesting things about Smith's work is how much respect he had for productive labor. In his time, wealthy landowners often enjoyed higher social status than farmers, but Smith looked at things differently. He focused on economic contribution, and farmers made an enormous contribution. Every city depends on food. Every factory worker depends on food. Every merchant depends on food. Every government depends on food. Agriculture supports the entire economic structure. Without it, everything else collapses. This doesn't mean farming is more important than every other profession. It means that agriculture provides the foundation upon which all other industries are built. The agricultural revolution came before the industrial revolution. When people discuss economic history, they usually focus on the Industrial Revolution, steam engines, factories, railroads, machines. Those developments were certainly important, but Smith would likely remind us that none of them could have happened without earlier agricultural improvements. Before factories could fill with workers, someone had to produce enough food to support those workers. Before cities could expand, agricultural productivity had to increase. Before industrial growth could accelerate, farming had to become more efficient. In many ways, the agricultural revolution made the industrial revolution possible. One created the surplus, the other transformed that surplus into explosive economic growth. Why land was so valuable? Today, wealth often comes from technology companies, intellectual property, financial assets, and global businesses. But for most of history, land was the primary source of wealth. Why? Because land produced food, and food supported everything else. A productive piece of farmland didn't just feed one family, it could support workers, merchants, craftsmen, and entire communities. This explains why land ownership became such a powerful source of influence throughout history. Control the food supply, and you control a major part of the economy. But Smith also noticed a problem. Land ownership sometimes concentrated power in ways that slowed development. And this observation leads directly into one of the biggest themes of Book 3, when landowners become too powerful. At first, land ownership helps create stability. People cultivate fields, communities develop, agricultural production increases. But what happens when a small group controls enormous amounts of land? What happens when farmers lack freedom? What happens when economic opportunities become restricted? Smith believed these conditions could limit growth. Instead of encouraging productivity, they could trap societies in outdated systems. This is exactly what he believed happened in much of medieval Europe. Large landowners accumulated tremendous power. Economic freedom remained limited. Markets developed slowly, and progress often stalled. This is where the story begins to shift from agriculture towards politics and institutions. Because agriculture alone doesn't guarantee prosperity. The way society organizes land and economic power matters too. Agriculture creates wealth, but institutions shape growth. The bigger picture. Agriculture should have been the first step toward prosperity. It creates surplus, surplus creates specialization, specialization creates productivity, productivity creates wealth. That was the natural path Adam Smith believed societies should follow, but history didn't always cooperate. In much of Europe, powerful landowners and feudal institutions disrupted this natural process. Economic development became slower and more uneven than it should have been. And that brings us to the next major question. If agriculture creates the foundation for prosperity, why did medieval Europe remain economically stagnant for so long? Adam Smith's answer points directly at one of the most powerful systems in history: feudalism. Imagine living in a world where almost everything depends on one thing: land. Not your skills, not your business, not your education, not your ideas, just land. If you own it, you have power. If you don't, your future is largely controlled by someone who does. This was the reality for much of medieval Europe. And according to Adam Smith, this system became one of the biggest obstacles to economic progress. In Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, Smith explains why Europe remained relatively poor for centuries despite having fertile land, hard-working people, and opportunities for growth. His answer points directly at the feudal system, a system that concentrated power, limited freedom, and slowed economic development. What was feudalism? To understand Smith's argument, we first need to understand how feudalism worked. Picture Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Central governments were weak. Law enforcement was unreliable. Travel was dangerous. Wars were common. People needed protection. In response, a system emerged. Powerful landowners offered protection. In return, people worked their land and provided services. Over time, this arrangement evolved into feudalism. At the top were kings. Below them were nobles and lords. Below them were knights. And at the bottom were peasants and serfs. The entire system revolved around land ownership. Economic power and political power became almost the same thing. The problem with concentrated power. At first glance, feudalism solved an important problem. It created stability during a chaotic period. People had protection. Communities survived. Agriculture continued. But Adam Smith saw a major flaw. The system rewarded ownership rather than productivity. Think about it. A lord could become wealthy simply because his family controlled vast amounts of land. He didn't necessarily need to innovate. He didn't need to improve efficiency. He didn't need to build businesses. His wealth came from ownership. Meanwhile, the people actually working the land often had little incentive to increase productivity. If extra effort mainly benefited the landlord, why work harder? This lack of incentives became a serious obstacle to economic growth. Why incentives matter? One of the themes running throughout The Wealth of Nations is incentives. People respond to incentives. Businesses respond to incentives. Entire economies respond to incentives. When individuals benefit from innovation and hard work, productivity tends to increase. When rewards are disconnected from effort, progress often slows. Under feudalism, many farmers had limited control over the fruits of their labor. They worked land owned by someone else. Much of what they produced flowed upward through the social hierarchy. As a result, agricultural productivity often remained lower than it could have been. Smith believed this was one reason economic development moved so slowly. Wealth was locked in the countryside. Another problem was that wealth remained tied to land. Today, people can build wealth through countless paths: technology, manufacturing, finance, entertainment, entrepreneurship, professional services, innovation. In medieval Europe, those opportunities were far more limited. Most wealth stayed concentrated in rural estates. Economic activity revolved around agriculture. Cities remained relatively small. Markets developed slowly. Trade networks were limited. As a result, economic dynamism remained weak. Smith believed that societies become wealthier when resources flow toward productive enterprise. But feudalism often trapped resources inside rigid social structures. Lords wanted status, not growth. One of Smith's most interesting observations concerns the behavior of the aristocracy. Many feudal lords focused heavily on status and prestige. Large estates, private armies, lavish lifestyles, political influence. Their goal was often maintaining power rather than increasing productivity. From an economic perspective, this mattered, because wealth used to support luxury consumption is not necessarily being used to expand productive capacity. Imagine two wealthy individuals. One spends all his money on personal luxury. The other invests in businesses, infrastructure, and productive enterprises. Which one contributes more to future economic growth? The answer is obvious. Smith repeatedly argued that investment creates prosperity, while excessive consumption merely displays it. Why trade was limited? Feudal societies were also less friendly to trade. Local economies often remained isolated. Transportation infrastructure was poor. Roads were unreliable. Travel could be dangerous. Political boundaries created barriers. Markets were fragmented. This limited specialization. And as Smith explained in Book 1, specialization is one of the greatest sources of productivity. If people cannot easily trade with others, they cannot specialize as effectively. If they cannot specialize, productivity remains lower. And when productivity remains lower, wealth grows slowly. Everything connects. The missing ingredient, economic freedom. As Smith studied history, he noticed something important. The societies that became wealthier tended to give people greater economic freedom. Farmers gained more control over their land. Merchants gained more freedom to trade. Craftsmen gained more opportunities to build businesses. Markets became more open. Competition increased. Investment expanded. Productivity improved. Economic growth accelerated. The feudal system often restricted these freedoms, and, according to Smith, that restriction came at a significant economic cost. Why feudalism lasted so long? You might wonder, if feudalism was inefficient, why did it survive centuries? Because systems don't survive simply because they're productive. They survive because they serve powerful interests. Feudalism benefited the people at the top. Large landowners had little reason to dismantle a system that protected their wealth and influence. This is another lesson that appears throughout history. Economic progress is not always blocked by a lack of resources. Sometimes it's blocked by institutions that benefit from the status quo. Smith understood that economic development often requires changes in incentives, institutions, and power structures. The cracks begin to appear. Over time, however, the feudal system started facing pressure. Trade slowly expanded, markets grew, towns became more important, merchants accumulated wealth, new economic opportunities emerged outside traditional land ownership. For the first time, people could become prosperous without controlling huge estates. This shift may sound ordinary today, but at the time, it was revolutionary. A completely new source of wealth was emerging, commerce. And once commerce began expanding, the old feudal order slowly started losing its grip. The bigger lesson. Adam Smith's critique of feudalism wasn't really about kings, castles, or medieval politics. It was about incentives, productivity, freedom, and economic opportunity. He believed societies thrive when people are free to pursue productive activities, trade voluntarily, and benefit from their own efforts. Feudal Europe often limited those possibilities. As a result, economic growth remained slower than it could have been. But history was about to change. Because while feudal lords controlled the countryside, something powerful was happening elsewhere. Towns were growing, markets were expanding, merchants were getting richer, and these rising cities would eventually challenge the entire feudal system. That's where Adam Smith's story goes next, how cities helped transform Europe and changed the course of civilization itself. If you asked a medieval lord where wealth came from, the answer would probably be simple: land. Land produced food. Land generated rent. Land created power. Land determined status. For centuries, land was the center of economic life. But then something happened that changed history. Cities began to grow. And according to Adam Smith, the rise of cities may have been one of the most important turning points in human civilization. In Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, Smith explains how towns and cities slowly transformed Europe. Not through military conquest, not through royal decrees, but through commerce, through trade, through ordinary people looking for better economic opportunities. And in the process, cities helped create the modern world. Cities created a different kind of wealth. Before cities became major economic centers, wealth was largely tied to land ownership. If you wanted power, you needed land. If you wanted income, you needed land. If you wanted influence, you needed land. Cities changed that equation. For the first time, people could build wealth without owning vast estates. A merchant could become prosperous through trade. A craftsman could build a successful workshop. A shipbuilder could earn a fortune. A blacksmith could expand a business. A trader could connect distant markets. Suddenly, wealth came from economic activity rather than inheritance alone. This was a revolutionary shift because it meant talent, effort, and entrepreneurship could matter more than family background. Why people were drawn to cities. Imagine life as a peasant in the countryside. Your opportunities are limited. Your future is often tied to the land where you were born. Economic mobility is rare. Now imagine hearing about a nearby town, a place where merchants are buying and selling goods, where craftsmen are earning money, where new businesses are opening, where people can make a living through trade instead of agriculture. That sounds attractive. And that's exactly what happened. Cities became magnets for ambition. People moved toward opportunity. They sought greater freedom. They searched for ways to improve their lives. Over time, towns expanded into thriving economic centers. Markets bring people together. One reason cities became so powerful is that they concentrated economic activity. Think about what happens when thousands of people gather in one place. Customers appear, businesses appear, workers appear, suppliers appear. Ideas spread, knowledge spreads, opportunities multiply. A farmer selling crops, a baker selling bread, a carpenter building furniture, a merchant importing goods, a tailor making clothes. All these activities reinforce one another. The city becomes an ecosystem of exchange. This concentration creates enormous economic energy. And according to Smith, trade thrives when people can easily interact with one another. Specialization explodes inside cities. Back in Book 1, Smith explained the power of specialization. Cities supercharge that process. In a small village, one person might perform many different tasks. In a large city, people can specialize intensely. One person makes shoes, another dyes leather, another transports materials, another manages inventory, another handles sales. Each person becomes better at their specific role. Productivity rises dramatically. This is one reason cities often become engines of economic growth. The larger the market, the more specialization becomes possible, and the more specialization becomes possible, the more productive society becomes. Commerce creates independence. One of Smith's most interesting observations is that cities gradually reduce the power of feudal lords. Why? Because commerce created alternatives. In the feudal system, many people depended directly on landowners. Their livelihoods were tied to agricultural estates. But city economies worked differently. People could earn income through trade, through craftsmanship, through manufacturing, through business ownership. Economic independence started growing. And when people become economically independent, traditional power structures begin to weaken. This wasn't a sudden revolution. It happened slowly, generation after generation, but the effects were profound. The merchant class begins to rise. As cities expanded, a new group emerged, merchants. Today, business owners seem normal, but in medieval Europe, the rise of wealthy merchants represented a major social change. These people weren't powerful because they owned huge amounts of land. They became powerful because they created economic value. They connected markets, moved goods, financed trade, built businesses, accumulated wealth through commerce. For centuries, landowners dominated society. Now merchants were becoming influential too. This shifted the balance of power. Economic success increasingly depended on market activity rather than noble titles. And Smith saw this as a major force behind Europe's transformation. Cities reward productivity. Another reason Smith admired commercial towns is that they rewarded productivity more directly. In feudal societies, wealth often came from ownership. In commercial societies, wealth increasingly came from creating value. If a merchant offered useful goods, customers bought them. If a craftsman produced high-quality products, demand increased. If a business operated efficiently, profits grew. Success became closely connected to performance. This created stronger incentives for innovation, and innovation drives economic growth. Why trade creates prosperity. The growth of cities also expanded trade networks. Local markets connected to regional markets connected to international markets. Goods moved farther, ideas spread faster, opportunities multiplied. A town that once depended only on nearby customers could suddenly trade with distant regions. This increased competition, expanded choice, lowered costs, and encouraged further specialization. Everything Smith taught in Book 1 about trade began to operate on a much larger scale. The result was rising prosperity. The real revolution. When people think about major historical revolutions, they usually picture wars, political movements, or dramatic events. Smith saw something different. He believed one of the greatest revolutions in history happened quietly, through markets, through trade, through cities, through ordinary people pursuing economic opportunity. No king planned it, no government designed it, no army enforced it. Millions of individual decisions slowly transform society, and over time, those decisions weaken the old feudal order. The bigger lesson. The rise of cities changed the source of wealth. Power no longer depended entirely on land. Commerce created new opportunities. Markets expanded, specialization increased, merchants grew richer, economic freedom expanded, and as cities continued growing, something remarkable happened. The very system that had dominated Europe for centuries began to weaken, not because it was defeated in battle, not because kings abolished it overnight, but because commerce slowly made it obsolete. And that's exactly where Adam Smith takes the story next. A surprising argument that would become one of the most famous ideas in Book 3. Feudalism wasn't destroyed by soldiers. It was destroyed by trade. Most people think old systems collapse because of wars. A king is overthrown, an army is defeated, a revolution erupts, a government falls. That's how history is usually taught. But in Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith presents a very different idea. He argues that one of the most powerful systems in European history wasn't destroyed by soldiers, it was destroyed by shopping. That sounds ridiculous at first. How could commerce defeat feudalism? How could merchants succeed where armies failed? But the more you understand Smith's argument, the more fascinating it becomes, because according to him, the fall of feudalism happened gradually, quietly, and almost accidentally. The feudal lord's world. To understand what changed, we need to understand how feudal lords lived. Imagine being a powerful noble in medieval Europe. You own vast estates, thousands of acres of land, large numbers of tenants, agricultural production flowing into your estate. You don't need to compete in a market. You don't need customers. Your wealth comes from land ownership. For centuries, this system remained relatively stable. A lord's wealth was measured by how much land he controlled and how many people depended on him. The countryside was his kingdom. But then commerce began expanding, and everything started to change. The arrival of luxury goods. As cities grew and trade networks expanded, merchants began bringing new products into Europe: fine clothing, imported wine, jewelry, furniture, decorative items, luxury goods from distant regions. These products fascinated the aristocracy. For generations, feudal lords had been rich in land, but often limited in what they could buy. Now, merchants offered something new: choice. And once people discover new ways to spend money, their behavior often changes. The nobles wanted these goods, lots of them. The problem was that luxury goods usually required cash, and feudal wealth wasn't always highly liquid. Land produced income, but not always in the form needed to support endless consumption. Commerce changed incentives. This is where Smith's argument becomes brilliant. The old feudal system was built around power, but commerce was built around incentives. The old aristocracy suddenly had a reason to generate more money, not to strengthen the economy, not to improve society, simply because they wanted more things. Luxury consumption changed behavior. To obtain cash, many landowners began altering the way their estates operated, and these changes unintentionally weakened the feudal system itself. The Great Trade-off. In the old system, many peasants had obligations to their lords: labor services, various duties, restrictions on movement, limited economic freedom. But as commerce expanded, some landlords discovered something interesting. Collecting cash rent was often easier than maintaining complicated feudal obligations. Instead of demanding labor directly, they could lease land. Instead of controlling every aspect of rural life, they could allow greater independence. Instead of relying on traditional feudal relationships, they could operate more like business owners. At first, these changes seemed small, but they created powerful long-term effects. Freedom becomes profitable. One of the great ironies in Smith's story is that many nobles didn't grant greater freedom because they believed in liberty. They granted greater freedom because it became economically useful. A farmer who controls more of his own output often works harder. A tenant with stronger incentives usually becomes more productive. A person allowed to benefit from improvement is more likely to invest effort. As economic freedom expanded, productivity often increased. Agricultural output improved, markets became more active, trade expanded further. The economy became more dynamic. The old feudal structure slowly weakened, not because people voted against it, because better incentives made alternative arrangements more efficient. Merchants challenged the aristocracy. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Merchants were getting richer. For centuries, social status came largely from birth. If you were born into nobility, you possessed advantage. By the time we reach the end of Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, something remarkable has happened. What started as a discussion about agriculture, land, and medieval Europe has turned into a much bigger story. A story about how entire civilizations change. A story about why some societies grow richer while others remain trapped in old systems. And most importantly, a story about where prosperity really comes from. At first glance, Adam Smith seems to be writing history, but underneath the history lesson, he's delivering one of the most important economic messages in the entire book. Prosperity is not created by power. Prosperity is created by productivity. That is the central lesson of Book 3. The old world was built on power. For most of human history, wealth and power were closely connected. Kings ruled because they controlled land. Nobles ruled because they controlled land. Armies fought over land. Empires expanded to gain more land. The assumption was simple: more territory equals more wealth. More control equals more prosperity. This idea dominated political thinking for centuries. If a ruler wanted to become richer, he usually focused on acquiring more territory. If a kingdom wanted greater influence, it built a larger army. Power came first, economic activity came second. But Adam Smith believed this way of thinking misunderstood the true source of wealth. The New World was built on production. As commerce expanded, a different reality emerged. Cities became wealthier. Merchants accumulated fortunes. Manufacturing expanded. Trade networks connected distant regions. Economic growth accelerated. And surprisingly, much of this happened without direct control from kings or aristocrats. People were creating wealth through productive activity, through work, through specialization, through investment, through innovation, through trade. This was something entirely different from the old feudal model. Instead of wealth flowing from political power, wealth increasingly flowed from economic productivity, and that changed everything. Why cities won? One of the biggest themes of Book 3 is the rise of cities. Smith saw cities as engines of transformation, not because cities were perfect, but because cities rewarded productive behavior. In a city, people could improve their lives through skill and effort. A craftsman could grow a business, a merchant could expand trade, a manufacturer could increase production. Success became increasingly connected to economic contribution. This created stronger incentives, and stronger incentives created more productivity. Over time, city economies often outperformed rigid feudal systems. The future belonged to commerce, not castles. The hidden weakness of feudalism. Looking back, feudalism appears powerful. Large estates, powerful nobles, military strength, political influence. But Smith saw a hidden weakness. The system didn't create enough incentives for growth. Too much wealth depended on ownership, too little depended on productivity. People who controlled resources often had little reason to improve them. Meanwhile, people doing the actual work often had limited rewards for innovation. The result was stagnation. The system could survive, but it struggled to generate sustained economic progress. This is why Smith believed commercial societies eventually pulled ahead. Freedom creates growth. One idea keeps appearing throughout the wealth of nations. Freedom matters, not just political freedom, economic freedom, the freedom to buy, to sell, to invest, to start businesses, to move resources toward productive opportunities. Smith observed that when people have greater freedom to pursue economic activity, societies often become more prosperous. Markets expand, competition increases, innovation accelerates, productivity rises, living standards improve. This doesn't mean every market is perfect or that every business succeeds. It means that free economic activity tends to unlock human potential in ways centralized control often cannot. Why ordinary people changed history. Perhaps the most surprising part of Book 3 is who the heroes are. Not kings, not generals, not emperors. Ordinary people. Farmers improving production, merchants expanding trade, craftsmen developing skills, entrepreneurs pursuing opportunity, consumers making choices. These individuals rarely appear in traditional history books, yet Smith believed they played a larger role in economic progress than most rulers ever did, because they created value, and value creation is what ultimately drives prosperity. This idea remains incredibly powerful today. The same story continues. Even though Smith was writing in the 18th century, the pattern he describes still appears everywhere. Think about modern economic success. Countries that encourage innovation often grow faster. Regions that attract investment often become wealthier. Cities that support entrepreneurship often expand rapidly. New industries emerge. Technology transforms production. Markets create opportunities. The details change. The underlying forces remain surprisingly similar. Productivity still matters, investment still matters, innovation still matters, economic freedom still matters. The real source of national wealth. One of the greatest contributions of Adam Smith was changing how people think about wealth itself. Before Smith, many leaders believed wealth was mainly about gold, silver, land, or political control. Smith challenged that idea. He argued that the real wealth of a nation is its ability to produce, its farms, its workshops, its factories, its businesses, its workers, its skills, its productive capacity. A country becomes wealthy not because it possesses treasure, it becomes wealthy because it continually creates value. That idea became one of the foundations of modern economics. Bringing Book 3 together. Let's look at the entire journey. Agriculture created surplus. Surplus allowed specialization. Specialization increased productivity. Cities expanded trade. Commerce rewarded enterprise. Merchants challenged feudal power. Economic freedom expanded. Markets grew. Productivity increased further. The old feudal order gradually weakened. A new commercial society emerged. This wasn't a sudden revolution. It happened over centuries, but it transformed the world. The final lesson. If Book 1 taught us how wealth is created through specialization and exchange, and Book 2 taught us how wealth grows through capital accumulation and investment, then Book 3 teaches us why some societies embraced those forces sooner than others. Adam Smith's ultimate conclusion is surprisingly simple. Nations become prosperous when they create conditions that allow productive people to thrive, not when they concentrate power, not when they protect privilege, not when they preserve outdated systems, but when they encourage production, trade, investment, innovation, and opportunity. That lesson was revolutionary in Smith's time, and more than 250 years later, it remains one of the most influential ideas ever written about how societies become rich.